hello. This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. Here with me today is William.
Hey, how are you doing?
Owen.
Hey, Gil.
And Lillian.
Hi, Gil.
Hi, everybody. So today we're recording the very first episode of the podcast, and I think we're going to be starting it off right with a discussion on Louis Althusser, who is one of the most important influential Marxist philosophers of the 20th century. So in the past week or so, all four of us have taken a look at a couple of his pieces from the mid to late 1960s. I've long been a big fan of, really influenced by Althusser, but I thought it would be a good place for us to sort of kick off this project that we're doing together, because I think all four of us share a couple of the ideas that he expresses in these pieces. And in particular for us, like all four of us are trained philosophers. And I think we all kind of agree in one way or another in the idea that there is an important class political dimension to philosophy and philosophical work. That, as he puts it, philosophy is like class struggle in theory, which is something that I think the four of us all kind of agree on in some form or fashion. And it's something that we've not always found is true of academic philosophy, that it represents, as Althusser would put it, other interests, bourgeois class interests instead of working class or proletarian interests. So there's the pieces that we looked at for today were Philosophy as a Revolutionary Weapon and Lenin in Philosophy, which are both in the volume Lenin in Philosophy. And also, I think some of us may have had a chance to look at this essay, Theoretical Practice, Theoretical Formation, Ideology, and Ideological Struggle, which is contained in the volume Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists. And the more sort of popular piece that I think all of us have known from other contexts, which is like super well known, is Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, also collected in Lenin in Philosophy.
When we post this episode, we're going to post citations and where you can find those pieces, right?
Yeah, totally. Awesome. The episode description should have all of this info, but I'm kind of just tossing it out there. So like I said, I think the sort of starting point maybe for our discussion could be this idea of philosophy as sort of class struggle in theory, like what it is exactly that means, and what it means to undertake this kind of struggle, as he puts it. Right? At a couple of places, he says things like, philosophy is this function of like drawing a dividing line, which I think is really powerful. I find it really helpful. A lot of times I find that, I want to see more lines drawn, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't like a nice stark division every now and again? But, I guess, I would like to throw out my first question. So I'm a little bit, newer to Althusser, so I kind of want to get clear on things. But, it seems as if at least part of the struggle is about educating the class instincts of the proletariat, but also revolutionizing the class instincts of the intellectual. How do you all think that works? So I go back and forth where it seems as if partially Althusser is saying that, something needs to come from the outside to help with the proletarian struggle, but also the intellectual, the bourgeois intellectual who can be caught with other interests, other worldviews must also be freed from how they see things. So how is theory supposed to do this? Does it have anything to do with what he talks about with science?
No, I like this idea, first of all, just even identifying, like if you step back from the way you put that question and just the importance of even identifying that there are class instincts among intellectuals, right? Because one of the things I take Althusser to be doing is to be attacking philosophy's sense of its autonomy, right? The idea that, there's an autonomous philosophical practice, and then there are fields like, normative philosophy, political theory, where then you go out and apply these kind of crystalline concepts that you've developed in cool isolation. So just the idea that there is an unassailable and ineluctable embeddedness of all philosophical practice inside a set of real material struggles, and that there's no option of extricating philosophy from those material struggles. You can either relate to them self-consciously, i.e. read some, take Marxism seriously, take historical materialism seriously, or you can
there's
just
like one way to do it, isn't there?
Yeah, of course. Exactly.
We're into dividing lines over here.
Yeah, we're
Exactly.
dividing lines.
Or you can just get bogged down in idealist illusions and the illusion of that philosophical autonomy. And I like that he's that's the decision he lays out for us.
I mean, listen, okay, so I think that philosophy, the way it thinks about itself is that it's like the queen of the sciences, you know what I mean? It's like a step removed. And it's the thing that's able to create the theory of other things and like create a place. You're like an observer of the other sciences, their methodologies, their assumptions. And one of the things that Althusser brings up is that what drives philosophers like more crazy than like any other things that drive them crazy is like political people, like people who are part, like, you know, because the essay is about Lenin, yeah. So, but I also think Lenin's kind of a stand-in figure for like every other political person. So like if you go into a room and everybody is like waxing philosophical about justice or about some concept that they think is like describing the world at large, and you're just like, yeah, but like, why is this useful to like so-and-so? Or like, how is this going to help me address this problem? Like, that's like the kind of question that is going to make a philosopher like extremely nervous. And they're like, well, that's not my job. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're going to say, I don't have a program. Like,
well, yeah. So like the worst thing you can ask somebody at like a conference is just like, okay, so like, what do you think? Like, and I do this kind of shit all the time. So I know the reaction. I'm like, so what do you like think about, like capitalism? Like, or like, what do you think about socialism? Like, why can't socialism be the alternative? Why is it this like abstract thing that like has you have all these principles, and like, why can't you like put a name to that? Like, what's the problem? And the problem is like the unwillingness to like create dividing lines, because in the context in which people are arguing, there's this kind of like bourgeois civility that goes down. And the reason that like Althusser brings attention to Lenin is because Lenin doesn't give a fuck about any of that.
Yeah.
And so there's this way in which like Lenin is in this position, or whoever I think Lenin's really like an archetype of the political person. He's the person who's able to create a theory about philosophy. He's able to see philosophy from the outside and be like, hey, so actually like, so, okay, an example, people who are really into like Foucault, nothing drives them crazier than being like, actually, like your interest in Foucault and your like attachment to this paradigm is that it's like a part of neoliberal discourse. That drives them insane because they can't like think about it as like, I'm a symptom of my time. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah, it's not true. It's not true.
It couldn't be. What's interesting?
Maybe not true of a certain Foucault. It seems true of other Foucaults.
Oh, by the way, I wasn't making that as a declarative statement. I was just playing a role of saying it's not true.
The aggrieved intellectual. Yeah.
Yes, who is deeply wounded. But so what's interesting about drawing dividing lines is that it seems like sometimes the dividing line is drawn between doing philosophy and doing politics, which allows for an obscuring of the fact that sides are being picked, but drawing that dividing line so that one doesn't have to make distinctions. I was part of a conversation recently. It was around, I hope this isn't controversial, I don't think it will be, is around Jean-Paul Sartre. And someone was trying to convince me. JP. I knew it was going to be controversial. I knew it wasn't. Who was trying to convince me that Sartre's interesting politically, but philosophically there's nothing there. And I kept trying to push them like why that distinction was so firm. And the person was willing to concede, sure, his politics are nice, but there's not much there. And I thought that's an interesting way to dismiss what is going on, and also the way philosophy can be engaged. And it seemed like there is actually a philosophical move being made there to make something non-philosophical, which Althusser pushes on and is saying, no, that's not a natural choice. That is actually, in essence, a political choice being made, right?
Totally. I mean, well, so like, yeah, he says that there's two things that philosophy, like to piggyback on what Lillian was saying, the philosophers find intolerable. And one is that that a politician, like, a lowly politician could have something to teach philosophy. And the other is that like philosophy could be made the object of a kind of thinking, right? That itself, instead of just being like the mode of thought itself, or just like the way that thinking happens, that it could be made the object of reflection. And philosophy usually thinks that it's the only thing adequate to task, right? It's sort of, philosophy can be reflexive on itself or take itself as an object. But Althusser is very clear. He's like, no, well, in order for this to work, you'd have to have like a non-philosophical theory of philosophy, right? A theory of philosophy. And that theory is going to like take its coordinates from politics on the one hand and something like the state of scientific knowledge on the other, right? Both of which he thinks are external to philosophy and the work that philosophy does itself. The other thing I was thinking, Will, when you said that is like, when someone says something like, oh, we've got like philosophy on the one hand and politics on the other, right? Like, you know, we can isolate the political and the philosophical lines in a given thinker. It's nonsense, right? And like the reason why it's nonsense, it's actually kind of interesting. I think that like, you know, Zizek got a lot of play a bunch of years ago for saying things like the most ideological thing you can say is that you don't have an ideology or that you're outside ideology. Like that's the most, like if you say that, you're just telling on yourself. You're like, I'm trapped, right? I don't know what I'm talking about. And in the same way, like I think that's the sort of thing that Althusser is saying about philosophy. You don't get to say that your philosophy is apolitical or that it doesn't express some political movement tendency, that it doesn't take a position, right?
What would that even mean?
What would that even mean? I don't even know, right?
And by the way, I just want to like say, you know, just quick side note for our viewers at home. I promise Zizek will not be someone who keeps coming up in this podcast.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry.
You know, even a broken clock, right? But you know.
It's a broken clock situation. I think everything you need to know about Zizek is that he recently wrote a book called Sex, the Failed Absolute. It's like, all right, 𝙁𝙗𝙙𝙬𝙗. I don't know, man. You're on your own.
I do not know.
Okay, so you were saying that like philosophy is like the most ideological thing you can say is if you don't have an ideology. So I remember this website. It's called like centrismbiz. Have you visited this website?
.biz?
No, that sounds so good though.
Wow. Okay, so it's literally like this website like parodying like centrist thought that makes me think it's kind of like philosophy. So it's like the headline is like, what if a movement ... stood still? And then it's and then centrism.biz rejects ideology. Are facts ideology? Is evidence an ideology? Is zealously pursuing low taxes for the rich, deregulation, privatization, austerity, military interventions, and aggressive policing while masking that ideology with feel-good, socially progressive sounding pablum and ideology? No.
You mean to tell me that's ideology? Get out of here. That's
well,
crazy.
then I guess everything's ideology. It's just, you know, there's nothing. It's just chaos, I guess.
That's so funny. No, but even in this piece, right, in Lenin and Philosophy, he says that philosophy, this is a quote, philosophy, like religion and ethics, is only ideology, right? And then, you know, weird things follow from that on his line. It has no history. Everything that looks like it happens inside, it actually happens outside it, right? In the only real history, the history of the material life of human beings. But he thinks that philosophy is a kind of ideology and that there's no outside to that. And then the interesting and hard thing to think, I think, for him and for us, I guess, right, is like that doesn't mean that there aren't truths produced in and through this like ideological sort of discursive formation or like this like mode of doing thinking. But like that's not what it essentially is, right? Like sometimes truths can be produced and like then like the philosophical work is to try to distinguish those true from false ideas. But you don't get to say that you're outside of ideology just because you're doing philosophy. Right? And again, like, you know, as Lillian's rightly pointed out, like philosophers hate hearing that. Like tell that to anyone at a conference.
I think we should, you know, say a little bit more about what Althusser thinks ideology is. So I was kind of surprised by this, honestly, where it's not simply false. It is, you know, ideology, sure, it's a distortion, but, you know, something still true comes through ideology, I take it, because it's still connected to, you know, what he calls the social totality. And so it seems to me that allows him the out of, you know, not, you know, contradicting himself in a fatal way, which is, you know, simply saying philosophy is, you know, also ideological, doesn't mean that it can't actually express something true if the proper relation is brought to it. But, you know, getting there, I was wondering what you all thought about that. He seems to think that there's this essential, quote, theoretical time lag for philosophy and science. So I guess I have two questions. One, how can ideology still, gain us some territory of truth? And two, why do we still need philosophy, if it is the case that's always chasing this science that actually does clarify the social totality? Isn't philosophy just useless on this account?
Well, I think one way to start answering that is his claim. I take it to be his claim that philosophy doesn't create or generate truths, right? Truths are generated by science, right? So, and what philosophy does is, and I guess this is how you would distinguish it from ideology, is that philosophy organizes and clarifies, it ramifies and disseminates those truths that are created in non-philosophical fields. So then ideology then would be a field of thinking that distorts what is the truths that are being generated in these other fields, right? It takes insights from empirical sciences, and it filters them through, let's say if we're talking about ideology and philosophy, through empiricism or through positivism, right? And then so you're getting, discoveries and important kind of breakthroughs, important truths that are being generated in the sciences, and you're having them ideologically distorted by philosophers who are into empiricism and positivism and other idealist forms of philosophy. Does that make sense?
I'd also say that, yeah, it does. It totally makes sense. The other thing part of why I've been so in love with Althusser for so long is because I'm a Spinozist, and I see Spinoza all over this, right? And so let me just tell you what I mean by that, right? Spinoza distinguishes between three kinds of ideas or three kinds of knowledge, right? This first kind of knowledge that he says is inadequate. He'll also say imaginary. And then the second kind is adequate knowledge, but it's kind of knowledge of relations or things in common, right? He calls them common notions. And the third kind is also adequate knowledge, but it's adequate knowledge of individual things. He calls singular essences.
Yeah, and imaginary ideas aren't wholly inadequate.
They're
right?
not.
They're
Totally
just confused,
They're not
muddled,
false.
and more deficient than more adequate ideas.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so there's a couple of things about this way of parsing the difference in these different kinds of ideas or knowledge that I think is helpful and useful here. And one of them is that for Spinoza, and I mean, I think probably for every genuinely critical thinker, you can't just say that even a false idea has to have some reality to it. It's got to have come from somewhere. Okay. And in that relation, that anchorage, where did this imaginary idea come from? That expresses something true, actually. So now there's something true even in the inadequate. Right. And so the examples that Spinoza will give are I don't know, it looks like the sun's 200 feet away. Or the examples that Althusser will give, and I think that we think about ideology in this sort of Marxist register. It's I'm the producer of the conditions for my own existence. Whereas in fact I'm beholden to the system of capitalist exploitation. But even in thinking that about myself, which is in a certain sense inadequate, well, there's still something true about it. At the same time, it expresses something about the way that my understanding works and how that's got a history and a genesis in this social and material reality. So that's the first thing that's cool about, I think, inadequate ideas in Spinoza's terms, ideology and Althusser's. The second thing that I think is really important is that it doesn't go away, right? Just because you get outside of it, just because you get outside of your ideological sort of representation of yourself and grasp something truer than what you thought before, those imaginary ideas continue to do work. They still continue to really determine your understanding and your desire, right? I can know that I can prove if I'm being careful that just to take an example from Capital One, that there's a difference between absolute and relative surplus value and whatever. And then I'm still gonna go to work the next day and think that maybe this is gonna be fine. Maybe I'll be one of the ones who makes it or something like this, right? And so the ideological stuff stays there. And so the work then is Owen was saying of philosophy seems to be trying to do that now dividing line work internally to these representations that populate our minds, the ones that are more and less adequate, right? Truer and falser, with the understanding that there's no fully false idea. What would that even mean, right?
I feel like a fantastic example of what you're saying is about like academics seeking jobs. So like everyone knows,
100%.
right? Like everyone knows what is wrong with this scenario. Everybody knows that there's no jobs. Everyone knows that this is not a meritocracy, and like how it's like you hardly even need to say it. Like, you know, it's bullshit basically. But then as soon as like people are actually competing for jobs, suddenly everyone deserves it. Like, so everyone feels like they're entitled to the position they got. You know what I mean? And like, I find that really.
No, it's just like you're like, I'm a little shook is all.
Well, okay, like think about how many times like even like left liberal academics will sit around being like, yeah, meritocracy is a myth, right? Like, we know America is like this capitalist, racist, and sexist place, and like we know how unfair the world is. But as soon as you're competing for the job, or as soon as you get a spot that like you know is like a product of like a tight labor market, like you are going to get really defensive if like someone tells you that like maybe you don't deserve that job any more than any other person deserved that job. So that you're going to have to like develop a set of justifications. And the more honest of academics will be like, yeah, totally, that was like luck, and I'm really grateful. But like for the most part, people have a really hard time accepting that they are in some way like not solely responsible for their success, especially, and like I think that this plays out differently, like depending on who you are and what your background is. But for the most part, like a lot of academics come from like middle class backgrounds and so on, and there's just kind of like a resistance to like thinking about your class position as like a thing that's actually not only informing your income or wealth, these like tangible material things, but your actual outlook on the world. You know what I mean? So like, and then, so even when you get critical of it, when it comes into, when your critical ideas come into conflict with like the things you need to believe about yourself to like kind of have the job you have, it's very difficult to let go of those things. And like, likewise, if you don't get the job, you're going to be like, well, like, what does that say about me in relation to anything else? And the answer is nothing. It says nothing about you in relation to somebody else. But it's very hard to like not think about it like that. And I think it's true for all other labor markets as well, but it's just interesting for academics because academics think they're so like, critical of that.
And so so from what you said, would you agree with, because it seems like Althusser cashes out ideology is deeply connected to one's social class, their position within a totality. So, to maybe like parse it out, it's not just ideology at the level of, at the level of an individual subject, you can like get things wrong. We all make mistakes and all of that. It seems he wants to make something, in fact, he explicitly says, this is more robust than that. Yeah, sure. We all have our subjectivity, but, this ideology is not random. And it is playing a role in a particular organization of society. And so, academics, the fact that most of us come from a particular social class, whether we will or no, often will find ourselves at least acting as if we believe that ideology. And so I think there's also something interesting for Althusser, that ideology is not just in your head, it is about embodied practices and what you do in order to make sense of the actions you are undertaking. Does that sound about right to you all?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I think like one way of getting at what ideology is about is as you say, right, like how are ideas materially effective? Like, how do they actually make a difference? And like, this is one of the ways, right, in which it's on the one hand tied to class position. And these things aren't like, I think it's important to say here that like these things aren't like fully like deterministic, right? Which is why he gets to say things like, yeah, I'm quoting Lenin, who's quoting 𝙁𝙤𝙬𝙗 or whatever, and I say, I condemn academics as a mass for their being bourgeois, but not like without exception. Like, of course, right? Like, of course,
And we all believe we're the exception.
And everyone thinks they're the exception,
all four of us are exceptions.
Yes. Well, yes, I do know that I'm the
that's for sure.
exception. That's absolutely right. Oh, yes, no, all four. Yeah. Right. Yeah, nah, I got that. Yeah.
No, I am completely captured by ideology. I've barely ever distinguished anything adequate.
This is how you know that this man
can
is
attest to that.
truly captured by ideology. The one who says that they are captured by ideology is even more ideological than the one who says they have no ideology.
Yeah, I'm totally screwed. Yeah.
Feels like a thing Zizek would say, honestly. Sorry,
Yeah.
again. Sorry. I
Back.
wanted to ask a question about the determinism, though, because isn't Althusser often read just like, in sort of the general way as deeply deterministic? He has issues with humanism. I get it. It's in vogue to be against humanism, but those who still want to hold on to it, their reproach to Althusser is that it just seems like it's all structure all the way down. Is that not
Right.
correct?
Yeah, well, I don't know. So like, yeah, the charge is that it's structure without a subject, and that like, humanism, like, and so like the humanist ideologies, to use Althusser's way of throwing shade at this period of his work, by which he means people like Sartre, right? Sartrean humanism, but also I know, but then also like, in more
A lot
Voluntarism.
of shade against Sartre in that essay.
a lot of shade, right? No, and he means more broadly, like, existential phenomenology and subjectivism, which, big shots fired.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And the claim on their behalf is like, no, like the subject actually like has a kind of autonomy to it. It's not determined by its conditions. We've got our freedom. Like Owen just said, it's got a voluntaristic sort of core, whether that's one thing or another, right? And so like, more sophisticated versions will say it's not individual subjects or transcendental selves. Maybe it's, I don't know, groups. Maybe it's spirit, right? It's Geist. Who knows? But like, there's something there that's like free and freely self-determining.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Finish, Gil.
I was going to say, the other version of this like determinism picture that Althusser is accused of is like this like base superstructure thing, right? Where like ideology is part of the superstructure, and that's determined by the economic base. And like on that score, I think it's actually clear if you look at his texts that like he hates that image. He thinks that the base superstructure thing is like actually not the way to talk about this.
Well, that's a non-dialectical understanding of ideology, right? Which isolates it and doesn't understand its interrelation with base or material processes, right?
Right, yeah, as though it just moves in, as though the causality moved in one direction only.
Yeah, it's an idealistic kind of ideology. So
I'm going to throw some massive shade at Althusser right now. I think that like, I do actually think that like, I think that he tries to get away from the base and superstructure model, and I just don't think he's successful. And I think he's not successful because he doesn't actually know anything about economics or what actually happens in the base. Yeah, I do. So like, for example,
let's do it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
there's like, I mean, there's like this, so when I read this stuff about ideology, I'm at once like very sympathetic, because like a sympathetic reading is like this dude is talking about how people are trying to like make sense of the world, and how like, as you're saying, they have inadequate ideas about the world. Most people, I mean, like take people who try to systematize their ideas and like spend half their lives trying to develop like frameworks that are consistent aside, most people have lots of inchoate ideas because their job isn't to like sit around making them systematic in the same way that it is for like a professional philosopher. So there's a way in which he's talking about kind of like the things that determine you that you don't always think are determining you, and how you come to have ideas about that based on your immediate like experience, and then how you kind of rationalize and justify your like way through the world. And I think that's all like extremely good. I think there is a structure to like the way people go about making sense of the world. And I think that the kind of like fashionable voluntarism that like develops in the some of the more like post-structuralist traditions that like came after Althusser is very unappealing for this reason. But one thing that really influenced me when I started reading Althusser was his debate with E.P. Thompson. So E.P. Thompson goes after him in The Poverty of Theory because he's a historian. And I think that like to be sympathetic to E.P. Thompson and critical at the same time, he's like not a very good theorist because he's a historian. So like he actually he is trying to communicate to the world that the problem with Althusserian structuralism is that Althusser is not successful in modeling the kind of constrained fluidity that is social struggle. So like how working class people engage in class formation, develop working class organizations. Althusser because he doesn't actually, like, he has a kind of mechanistic idea of like the base, the economic base. So he doesn't see it to be necessary to like go in the base, figure out what is going on, like what drives people apart, what brings them together, how do they figure that out, what makes them weaker, what makes them stronger. So ideology becomes like the glue that kind of holds the social system together. And for that reason, I think the only relationship that Althusser is ever actually able to articulate between the ideology and the base is a functionalist one, and I think that's a mistake. So, like, that's a long way of I went on for a while, but I think that, like, to me, that's the problem with Althusserian ideology, despite the fact that I think Gil's right. There's a lot of really interesting things to say about it that I agree with.
I find the functionalism critique really interesting because so I guess like and definitely not disagreeing but seeing how to respond is does it get around the functionalism because by him giving this what he calls a relative autonomy to ideology, the idea that it seemed to me that what he was saying is that even though it's a distortion, the relative autonomy allows it to create a different type of logic even within itself that could be productive of action. I don't know, maybe I'm reading into that because when he starts talking about how religion is often the first encounter or formation of ideology, he makes a strange reference to the United States of talking about the role that religion plays in Black freedom struggles, which in many ways Christianity through many of the iterations, it was a form of a social bond to push back against the supervening social order. And so I wonder, is there like an inconsistency in Althusser there?
I don't know. I think like, so I certainly won't deny that like Thompson like probably has Althusser's number, like on the question of like the material dynamics of organization. His later work, Althusser like condemns the texts from the period that we're looking at as his theoreticist lapse. Right?
You didn't tell us that beforehand.
Kept that secret. Everybody knew. Well, we could read the later stuff too. It's interesting though. I mean, like he I think goes back on some of his positions here and not others. But I think that I've never quite understood. Maybe I'm showing my cards here. What the worry was about the theoreticism, because I think that it's correct insofar as he's trying to think about a theory of philosophy here, right? And that I think is like the value of this like these texts, and trying to triangulate that by way of reference to class struggle, material, economic, social reality, and something like the production of truths in science. But I agree though that like when it comes to like how class conscious the formation of class consciousness works in like material groups, like I don't think that that's what these texts are giving us, right? They're just not. But I'm also not sure that it's like closed either, right? Like that's why I wanted to. I'm not totally sold that that he fails to. Or I guess let me try it like this. I think that the introduction of this concept of relative autonomy is one of his like wild like theoretical like contributions here, right? Which like if it sort of like slides off the tongue now, but like that is like a pleonasm. That is a contradiction in terms, like on most ways of understanding what the word autonomy means. Like if it's autonomous, it's not relative to anything. And so like the idea of thinking about degrees of relative autonomy within contradictory wholes, which is how he talks about the relationship between like material organization and ideology, or also between like relations and forces of production, I think at least like is a potentially promising vector for trying to think about how these things hang together without being fully deterministic. It's also just like, I think like, I was thinking about this the other day, like in 1970. Owen, do you know this? When does Rancière write Althusser's lesson? I think it's like
I don't remember the exact year.
It's like 68. It's between like 68 and 1970 or something.
Okay.
Or yeah, Althusser's Lesson is a really it's a really wild book. But then the sort of
Come on, you think it's irritating?
I think it's a very irritating text, and I also think,
Truth
I mean,
comes out.
Yeah, no, I was thinking like one of the things that like someone like Rancière will say to Althusser as a kind of way of like challenging the project of ideology critique, which like, you know, my cards on the table, I think is an invaluable project that we need to remain sort of committed to in some form or fashion. But he'll like, you know, if you like look at his book Proletarian Nights, right? Rancière is like, look at all of the amazing stuff that these proles were doing. You mean to tell me that they were just captured by ideology? And I'm like, I'm not sure that in order for this picture to work, it needs to be true that like everyone from the working class is confused. Like, I'm not sure that that's the idea here, right? Like, at least empirically,
Yeah, that's the caricature of Althusser.
Right.
Okay.
I also think that there is in that later stuff. I mean, I don't know the later Althusser that well, but I have read the Machiavelli and Us book. What do you know what year that's from, Gil? 71 maybe, or
yeah, I think it's like mid 70s. I'll look it up. Go ahead.
Okay. But there he like there's a more robust attempt through a reading of Machiavelli's The Prince to try to reconcile structure and subject, you know, trying to integrate some of the critiques of the structuralist determinism. And there, what he says is that, yes, you know, subjects always operate within a field of determinacy, but that there are actually like contradictory or conflicting forces at work that are struggling to be the dominant force that determines the situation, that determines the future. And that within that kind of equivocal field of force relations in which it's not clear yet, like how things are going to go, and they might go one way, I guess in the context of his other work, you know, towards like revolutionary struggle, revolution, or they might go the other way, consolidation of capitalist social forces and political forces, but that within that space, within that void, there is a kind of aleatory opening, an opening for something. So it's not that it's a kind of blank slate for political subjects to be able to change things, you know, a blank slate for political subjects to be able to come up with a program and start trying to realize it, but that, you know, there are, again, a kind of equivocal field of force relations in which it's not clear yet where things are going to go, and that the subject has a degree of, obviously it's not voluntaristic, but a degree, the possibility to intervene in those structures if it can leverage the right kinds of forces, if it can organize itself in such a way as to make it, you know, make things turn out one way or the other. And I'm not sure, again, how compelling you would find that, Lillian or Gil, or people that are critics of Althusser on that point, but I think that's a helpful place to go.
In all fairness, like, I'll just say that I think most of the accusations of Althusser that he's like deterministic are just like stupid. I think the question of agency is like a non-problem. I mean, like,
Nice.
so I think it's a problem insofar as like he's not clear. Like I was saying, I don't think he knows very much about how economics works. So like what drives people, what would make some formations less likely than others, what makes solidarity happen in one case and not in another. Like, you just aren't going to get that picture from Althusser, and he doesn't give you the resources to think through that. And I think that's a mistake. On the other hand, like, I think this like obsession with determinism, like, I don't think he's like I think there's only so much agency there is and if you actually believe that there's like a social structure at all. So like people make decisions within constraints, and that's what I mean by there's only so much agency as there is. So I just don't understand this like constant like hunting for agency. Like, we can't, like, if we say it's deterministic, then we're like dominating people because we're denying their agency. And I'm like, this isn't like, I don't feel like I am dominating anyone. Like, people are, you know, by saying that there are constraints people are operating under. So like, you know, after Althusser, there was the post-structuralist turn, you know, and then everybody was just like, where's the agency? Like, let's find every little bit of agency that people have and like prove Marxism wrong by showing how much agency everyone has. And I'm just like, I think it's completely consistent. I know, checkmate. And then, but it's like completely consistent with the social theory to be like, yeah, people like try to resist. And the reason they're more or less successful is because they organize themselves in ways that are more or less effective in like addressing these constraints. It's not for lack of agency, it's for lack of freedom, you know? So like, it's not, I just feel like that's a false problem, and I'm just not sure what set everyone down the path of like finding the agency.
That is really great. And so like, look, you know, we're all putting our cards on the table on the first episode. I'm not quite sure, how good that is. So I was one of the people who, I heard about Althusser before I read him. And I'd heard of the critiques of humanism before I read him. And I came from humanism from, Fanon, what he's trying to work out with humanism. And I tried to think, I tried to give Fanon the benefit of the doubt and think he's not completely duped or anything, but it seems as if what happens with this ideology of humanism, this focus on agency, is it seems as if it's a way to avoid talking about structures. It's a way to try to maybe bracket out social constraints so that one can act as if we can isolate what it is to be an agent without having to talk about that stuff that we've already pitched to the side of politics, to the side of economics and all of that. And if that is the critique, because also be clear, Althusser is as critical of humanism as he is of economism. He thinks, in the sense that they are a doublet. Then that allowed me to understand, so apparently there's all this baggage that came with this, this thing called humanism that he's talking about in the mid 1960s. It's actually a theoretical maneuver to background certain issues and to foreground a type of subject that doesn't have to actually deal with a social reality.
Yeah, I think I
That's
could
really cool.
Yeah, I think we mentioned Sartre before, right? And so I'm gonna both save him and dunk on him real fast.
That's right? How you have to do it with him, though. You have to.
Yeah, you have to. Well, so I was thinking about how I think that it's the early Sartre who is a really good stand-in for this sort of voluntary this humanism that foregrounds a kind of agency or freedom that lets us get away with not talking about structure and social reality. And to be clear, I don't think that that's his last word on the subject, right? I think his later work, he really tries very hard to figure out how to think these things together in a dialectical way, which is,
please
maybe
read
not
Critique of
successful.
Dialectical Reason if you are out there. Please,
Right.
please.
But I'm thinking of the lines in Being and Nothingness where he's like, "Yo, what are you? If you're in a prison, you're still free, baby." And it's this can't be the right way to think about this, right? That can't be right. I guess maybe ontologically, but who cares? What are we talking about, right? And so that's the sort of caricature here. And again, that's not his final word on the subject.
You still free, baby?
Yeah, just transcend how your options of your factically given options for how you might respond to when the prison guard shows up, and it's you're in fucking jail. I don't know what you're talking about, right? So the other thing I wanted to go ahead.
Wait, I thought you said you were gonna dunk on Sartre and then save him. Where's the save him?
That wasn't his final word. Is that the save?
Yeah, that's the save
Weak
here.
save.
Yeah, he's smarter than that sentence he wrote. I believe. I do.
I'm just going to affirm you because we're a Sartre saving people here.
Yeah, we're the Sartre savers.
You will have to wait for our Sartre episode for our more robust saving. But
I didn't do a very good job here.
Let's do a little more dunking, just real quick, because in Being and Nothingness, he also has this passage where he talks about being sad. He's well, no, you're not being sad. You are choosing the comportment of one who is sad. And you know how I know this is true. This is Sartre. Well, when a visitor comes over, all of a sudden you're happy and you make an appointment with yourself to be sad again after they leave. So
unbelievable.
If I could just make appointments with myself to get out of my sad mood, sign me up.
I've forgotten.
I
keep forgetting to make appointments with myself to not be depressed.
Well,
I guess that's on me.
Well, yeah, that's bad faith, my dude.
That's bad.
So.
I am.
You don't really not want to be depressed. That's
I really
there
do
it is.
ultimately want to be depressed.
There it is.
I'm in deep bad faith. It's a tough time. The other thing I wanted to say, though, to get us back to Althusser real quick, is he's got all these lines, and so I don't know if any of you looked at a couple of these other essays of his from 1965. Which are in 4 marks. And I'm thinking of Contradiction and Overdetermination, and On the Materialist Dialectic. And there, when he's talking about this sort of this relation, this causal or expressive relation between things like economics or the economic base or infrastructure, to use the image that he's trying consciously to overcome, and the ideological superstructure, he always says things like, in the last instance, it's determined by the base. And he puts it in scare quotes, and then he says things like, "And the last instance, that moment never comes. That's not like something that ever actually happens."
Okay.
I know. But I think that like part of what he's trying to get at is like the logic of a tendency, maybe is one way to try to unpack this, right? That like there are like tendencies embedded within these social relations in terms of the kinds of subjectivities produced or ideological sort of milieus that are given rise to, which isn't the same as saying that there's like, a one-to-one direct causal relation. This can only go one way. And in that gap, right, is like Owen is saying, right, this like sort of non-closed field of ideas, right? Now there's something like an opening for like theoretical contestation and trying to empower truer ideas and disempower false ones. But the lonely hour of the economy that never arrives, he says.
Oh, that's a good line.
That's a good line.
So this actually brings me to what I'd like to hear from you all, because clearly Althusser thinks that this should change or transform our practice of philosophy. He seems to want to give a particular role philosophy can play in struggle. And so what I got from it, not from the essence from For Marx, but from Lenin and philosophy, is philosophy can play this retrospective role of giving meaning to formulations and great texts of philosophy, but I imagine it can also give a retrospective role to perhaps movements or things that are emerging within the social structure. And so what is this different type of practice of philosophy Althusser is looking for? Because I also think that this can kind of justify why we call this podcast What's Left of Philosophy, and I feel like that phrase is also kind of in Althusser's text. So what is left for the role of philosophy here?
It's totally in Althusser's text.
Okay, yes.
I didn't even know it was until I read it, and then I was like, Gil is so sly. He like made us name it after Althusser. Actually, this isn't even
yes.
an
It was all
accident.
Gil, by the way.
I didn't make anyone do
Gil's
anything.
ruse.
You're all self-choosing free subjects, okay?
Oh, bad faith again.
That bad faith again. So like one of the interesting things he says in this text, right, is that like when he says this stuff that is like super peculiar, that like philosophy has no history, right?
Right.
And he's like, I'm just picking up on this like completely like almost like aggressively like hostilely simplistic conception that Lenin buys, which is that the history of philosophy is just like this weird eternal struggle between idealism and materialism, right? And like
I love that.
I'm
love
down
that
with that.
That's
Yeah.
one dividing line. I'm so for it.
I'm totally down with that.
And so that's why he says it's got no history. Or if it's just the same struggle over and over again, with like the new idealists show up and they figure out how to dunk on last year's materialists, and then next year the new materialists arrive and are like, no, here's a new problem for the newer idealism. It's like nothing ever actually happens, right? And so like
It's true.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lillian's out here just like, yes.
Like, oh no.
Yes.
Right. And so like when he thinks that like Marxism means that there's a new practice of philosophy, he's trying to say like, okay, this means that like, he's on the side of the materialists, obviously, but we can't just like go on like saying materialism again, right? In response to the latest idealism in a way that doesn't matter, in a way that doesn't do anything. Like the new practice that he's talking about is this sort of like instead of like elaborating the newest materialism, right, which will always turn out to be like the condition or ground for the next version of idealism, to do this work of drawing these lines, right, distinction, trying to isolate the truths that are produced by the like ambient sciences and scientific practices, and those that are produced by the class struggle, right, in the site of politics and political contestation, which is to say to tether philosophy to practice first and foremost, right? Like to have its focus and emphasis be on practice as political practice and as the practice of the production of scientific knowledges or truths, and that's not the same as elaborating a new materialist account of either of those things, right? I think is supposed to be what's like novel about like this Marxist practice of philosophy.
I feel like that sounds good to me. I think that's true. But like I work in critical theory, you know, and I feel like at the top of like every fifth paper is like what critical theory is supposed to do is like explain or elaborate on the desires and wishes of the age, you know, this like famous Marx quote. And so like everyone thinks that's what they're doing. They're like looking at these movements and like they're like, here's the movement, here's its demands, let me like fit this into like my philosophical worldview. And there's a way in which this becomes like so impressionistic that this drives me up the wall. Like every decade it's like there's a new protest movement and people are like, well, the old thing is out and the new thing is in. And I'm like, okay, but why doesn't this have something to do with the fact that you're trying to like market your ideas on the academic like circuit? You know what I mean? Like, and so there's like how, I don't know what I'm asking. Like, I just think that there's this risk of being very impressionistic and also like using that to like your investment and like what movements are doing and what they're thinking and what their demands are to like justify your own like careerist move. Like imagine all the people after Occupy that were like, yeah, horizontalism, we don't need any leadership. And that became like for 5 years, it's like, let's explore this further. And then like
worked.
Times change. And then
And it worked. And horizontalism was good and smart and we figured it out.
We
right.
crushed it. We
do you know
crushed
what I'm
it.
saying though? Like it's
Yes.
like attaching it to practice. I'm for it, but like I'm not actually sure that's what Marxists think. Like I think Marxists have a social scientific methodology. Like if you are into that like guides the way that you interpret things. Like there's kind of like I think that's what he means by science. There's like a methodology that's at play that isn't just like let's absorb this new thing into my paradigm.
Yeah, that's really helpful because, you know, he wants to insist on the fact that philosophy ought to be induced by, I think is the word he uses, like induced by or indexed to politics, right? To particularly to class struggle. But then, yeah, so the question of how to do that is one that I've kind of struggled with a little bit because clearly he doesn't mean, I'm really happy you use the word impressionistic because that is, I think, so much of what the attempt to kind of calibrate your work to things that are happening in the political world turns into a kind of, I don't know, it turns into like takes, right? And you end up just like disseminating takes. Okay, they're like a little more sophisticated than our Twitter takes, you know, they're elaborated.
Mine are not.
Yeah, that's true.
Can
your Twitter
confirm.
takes are definitely. Your Twitter takes are definitely better than your work.
Thank you. Yes.
I kid. Your work's brilliant, but yeah. So I mean, I don't really have
my Twitter takes don't need to pass peer review.
That's true, but they have to pass the Twitterverse is rough, man.
Yeah, like woo! I prefer peer review.
I would win. Yeah, exactly.
Like damn, knives out on the Twitterverse.
No, so I don't really have an answer to what that looks like, but it is one of the things after reading that Lenin and philosophy piece that I was left the most thinking about. You know, what does it mean to actually have philosophy, have your philosophical practice be indexed to and induced by and spurred by politics and by struggle, but not have it necessarily, because I don't think he means that means your philosophy is about struggle. Like what you talk about all the time in your philosophy is like things that are happening in the world all the time, right? It's somehow, I don't know, that's the struggle that I've been having.
And yeah, the thing I just want to say real quick, because especially that was really helpful, Lily and Owen, is that he also seems to say that philosophy risks introducing deviations, or the French would be décalage, in the praxis that leads to defeat. So it seemed as if there are times when philosophy does index itself to things that are going on and kind of mutilates those things and leads it astray, miscasts it,
or capitalizes on them, and
right. Okay. And so I'm intrigued by what you're saying, Owen, that it's not saying that your philosophy has to be talking about every struggle that happens to be happening at that moment. And I wonder if that's about, like, again, the time lag. But I am still it's weird to hear him say something along the lines of what allows philosophy to be ideological, to the reason why the instincts of the intellectual need to be revolutionized is that it has some perceived autonomy from these other states of affairs. But then when it tries to no longer have that autonomy, it can actually still butcher or ruin what is going on there. And by ruin, I mean like miscast it, misinterpret it, and or capitalize on it. And so is he saying, is science supposed to allow you to have some sort of autonomy from your impressions, to use the language that Lillian's using, of being impressionistic? Is that what the role science is supposed to do?
Yeah,
I think so.
I think so.
I
Yeah.
think so. That sounds right. I mean, the other thing to point out is that like, so he's describing great philosophy as this weird repetition of like this age-old thing, right? This over and over materialism, idealism. But then he says that the lines of the philosophical front are displaced according to the transformations of the scientific conjuncture, i.e., according to the state of the sciences and their problems, and according to the state of the philosophical apparatuses that these transformations induce. So we have that word induce here. But I think it's important that he doesn't say that the front lines of the philosophical struggle are displaced according to the political struggle, right? They're displaced by the transformations in science and the scientific knowledges that are produced, which I think is interesting.
Isn't it by both though?
Well, so what he says here is that the two sides of this, if we want to try to hold them together, is that here's another quote from, this is very close to the end of the text. Philosophy represents politics in the domain of theory, or to be precise, with the sciences, and vice versa. Philosophy represents scientificity in politics, with classes engaged in the class struggle. But I think that this is why this is a whole other claim of his that we haven't even touched on yet, right? Like he says that Marx opens up this new continent of science, right?
Yeah, amazing.
It's amazing.
Science of history.
Yeah,
Science of
mathematics amongst the ancient Greeks, and then Galilean physics. And then historical materialism. Those are the three great tectonic movements.
I mean,
in the
I
history
think
of
this is totally true. Like, I don't really know. Like, okay.
Oh.
I mean, listen. Okay, so if you take a quick look at like every major like humanities or social scientific discipline aside from history, I think the historians are usually like pretty level-headed. They have their own like internal methodology game going on, and I don't know, I can't speak to that so well. But look at sociology. There's not a single thing in sociology that isn't a reaction to Marxism. Not a single thing. Every single major social theory, and if you could see me on the video, I'm like doing air quotes. Every single thing is a reaction to Marxism. So you've got like Emil Durkheim, you've got Marx, and then you've got Weber, which is a reaction to Marxism. And every single thing that's happened in sociology in the past 150 years is basically... but Bourdieu's a reaction to Marxism. The whole paradigm is trying to find an alternative to Marxism, because it's like bourgeois social science is like battling its own demon, so like it has to kind of keep the specter of Marx in the background to like prove why it's right. So like if you could just beat the, like, what's the expression? Like it's kind of like whack-a-mole with Marxism, it's like if you could just like beat it down everywhere you see it, then like finally it'll go away. But the problem is that the social conditions that Marx analyzes are still present, and Marxism isn't going to go away, and it's never fared very, very well in the academy, but it's not going away outside of the academy because the conditions still call for it. You know what I mean? So like there's that dynamic in sociology, and frankly, I think philosophy is the same shit. Like every fucking paper I read is like, well, Marxism got it wrong. Marxism got it wrong. I'm going beyond Marxism. The person I'm reading went beyond Marxism.
Man, we
like,
love
the whole
going
point
beyond Marxism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like going beyond Marxism is like the game,
it.
And so my question, and like literally, my question is always like, if you think Marxism is so wrong, and my guess is that you only know one Marxist in your life, if you know any of them, and I don't really know what to say. Like you keep like being preoccupied with this, but like if everyone around you disagrees and you disagrees, then just leave it alone. Like I don't talk about things I don't agree with at all and that I think are outdated. It's embarrassing.
Shut your mouth.
Like what?
It's okay. Just shut your mouth. It's fine. It's fine. Silence is golden. I learned that from when I went to the movies. Back in the day.
That's my shit talk of the evening, because I do feel like if it's not the case that this wasn't like if historical materialism wasn't a break in that, and if you want to, I don't know if you should characterize it as a break. He touched on something true. That's what I'm saying. It's like if there is a kind of like revolution and like a science of history or whatever, then to me, that's what makes sense of this like weird paranoia in the academy with Marxism.
You know, what's funny is, you know, it feels like if any of our listeners out there are tired of hearing about Marx and Marxism, want to truly go away, well, completely change the social conditions and
Oh man,
you will have
that's
your
a great
wish.
point.
I will never talk
Welcome,
about Marxism
comrades.
again once we abolish
No,
capitalist
under
relations
full
of production and exchange.
communism. Yeah, just give us full communism. You'll never have to hear his name again.
Look, I might switch sides under communism. I might be the new idealist.
Oh, hell yeah.
I'll be like all
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, don't you want to see us as idealists? You know, like, make it so.
Well, we
I mean,
won't know.
I just want to watercolor by the river and like think and like dream my dreams. I don't really want to do what I'm doing now forever under communism.
Oh, no, absolutely
you.
not.
All right. So I actually feel like, not to like, you know, step in like this, but there's so much to talk about even more with Althusser. Like, you know, we didn't even talk about what he means by epistemological break. But I think, you know, for now, I think, you know, maybe we can, you know, wrap it up a little bit. And
Sure.
I don't know, I could see us doing another episode in Althusser, honestly.
Maybe we're
like,
just
you
an
know-
Althusser podcast. We just talk about Althusser
Oh.
for
No,
for
it's
1
Gil-
hour every 2
Gil,
weeks.
Gil, can you let us get an audience before you send them all away first? Can you let that happen? No.
Okay.
you
I guess
can't.
I suppose I want an audience. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Maybe we'll come back to this. Well, maybe not immediately. There's definitely more to talk about. I think you're right.
Absolutely. I got a lot from this, honestly, and you know what? This is our first episode, but y'all are so brilliant. I am so happy to be doing this with you all. Like,
Aw.
you know, y'all
love you,
can't
Will.
see you can't see my face, but I'm smiling, so this isn't
We're
you
all
know,
beaming. We're all beaming.
Yeah, so nothing but good vibes here, even when we dunking on people.
Still vibing.
Click
Nothing but love.
click subscribe. Follow us on Twitter.
Like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Left of Phil. If you like what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Left of Philosophy. We'll also be putting things up on a YouTube page at some point in the near future. And we're really glad that you joined us for this. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.
Yeah, bye bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.